Hi, I'm Nick Long. I'm the head of new business development here at Nortel Limited, the makers of the Flexineb equine nebulizer. Today we're producing the first in hopefully a long series of highlights of individuals in the equine industry. Our first guest is Akaash Maharaj, who you'll find the introduction very early in this video. And our host is Emma McCabe, the managing director of our own company, Epic Management, here in Ireland. We hope to have this as an ongoing series. Cash is the first of many, we hope, of fascinating individuals in the equine industry. And if you're interested or know anybody that would be interested in joining this series, please send us a message at info@flexineb.ca. And we'll get back to you very soon. So we hope you find this fascinating as nearly as much as I did. I was very quiet in this video, but hopefully I'll be more active in the next installments. So thank you very much for your time, and please drop a like and share the video if you find it fascinating. Thank you. Bye.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining our talk today with Akaash Maharaj, who is a very accomplished person who's based in Canada at the moment and has a really fascinating story that we're going to hear about today, which basically links equestrianism and his conflict resolution work over the last few years. And he's going to tell us about what his future plans are also. So my name is Emma. I'm from Epic Management, and I work closely with Flexineb Nortel Limited, and we all work together, and we really want to just tell our story with Akaash and hear some more. So we hope you enjoy. So Akaash, thank you so much for your time today. If you could kick off with introducing yourself and tell us a bit about how you came to be.
How I came to be. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here and lovely to be part of this conversation. My name is Akaash Maharaj, as you said. I'm based in Ottawa, in Canada, and I've been involved with horsemanship. How I came to be? Well, that's my parents' fault, I suppose. I started riding as an adult, which is, as I'm sure you know, is unusual. Most of my peers were riding soon after they were out of nappies. But for myself, I came to the sport after university, after I came back to Canada from my studies. And I could not give you an obvious or easy reason for what it was that drew me to horses. It's something I was always interested in. It's not something I had the opportunity to be involved in as a child, but I seized the opportunity when it presented itself as an adult. And if you were to speak to any of my friends from school, and if you were to say to them that one day, Akaash, that I would be involved in sport in a serious way, they would be skeptical. If you were to say to them that I would one day be involved, I'd be an athlete for one of my country's national teams, they would laugh at you. And if you told them that it would be in equestrianism, they would fall about the floor laughing at you, because it really is very improbable for me. But I have to say, the first time I mounted a horse, I really had a sense that this was the sport for me. My body isn't particularly useful for many activities, but I have to say, it fit to the horse in a way that made me think that this was going to be my calling.
Amazing. And so, and that's so interesting at a later stage in life, because a lot of people do, as you know, start younger with horses. And that's what every horse person speaks about, is that connection you have with horses. Some people have no connection whatsoever and they treat horses, but you naturally were drawn to them whenever you started. And tell me, did you start tent pegging initially when you started to ride, or how did you go from just getting mounted to riding for your country and representing your country?
Well, because I started as an adult, I was looking for a way to practice riding and to develop my riding with other adults. And that was difficult as a beginner. One of the few ways that I found that I was able to do so was, somewhat eccentrically, riding with the Canadian Forces. Canada has two regiments that are historic cavalry regiments and still maintain horse-mounted troops for ceremonial purposes, not for operational purposes. One of them is based in Toronto, the Governor General's Horse Guards, where I was living at the time. So I started riding with them, and I enjoyed it a great deal. One of the activities that they use to develop the skills of riders is the sport of tent pegging, which is also known as equestrian skill at arms. It essentially has a rider riding at a full gallop over a timed course on the flat and over jumps, using a variety of weapons such as sword, saber, and lance to strike a series of targets. And as you can imagine, it's a sport that has been used historically to develop the skills of mounted warriors, and continues to be used today to develop the seat and abilities of people, military riders. And I took to it right away. I think it brings out the little boy in you, galloping around on a horse, waving a sword over your head. But again, it's a sport that really appealed to me. And no one was more surprised than I was, having taken up this sport as a required training technique, to discover that I had something of a natural talent for it. But I confess, I've never had a natural talent for any sport before. And so to have discovered it in adulthood was unusual. And to have discovered it in the sport as unusual as tent pegging, I confess, is somewhat outlandish, but I took to it right away. I competed for the regiment in national and North American competitions, and that took me quite quickly to the World Championships.
Absolutely incredible. And that's a big kind of note for everyone also to know, is that just because maybe earlier in life, if you haven't found your calling or your sport, that later on it is possible to find your love, especially when it comes to horses. And the amount of different disciplines there are with equestrian is unbelievable. And the skillet arms for the tent pegging, you have to be very brave and very fearless for that sport, Akaash. So does that link in with your work at the time, or what were you working at the time?
It's an interesting question. Brave is a kind way of putting it. Reckless would be another way of putting it. But certainly you have to be enthusiastic. And it's a sport that relies as much on nimbleness of mind as suppleness of limb. It requires an enormous amount of trust between the horse and the rider. And because it's a sport that is often conducted on unfamiliar mounts, so there are some competitions, especially in North America, where you ride your own horse. But at the international level, it's typical to ride unfamiliar mounts. So you have to be able to develop a quick rapport and a quick trust with the horse to be able to succeed at the sport. And I think that I will confess that when I went to the World Championships, though I did well, they were better. They were certainly better riders than me there. And they are still better riders. I think the reason I was successful was not so much because of superior riding skills, but because I was able to develop a rapport with the horses quite quickly. Also, some of the other competitors from other countries had the luxury of having been able to ride highly trained horses, whereas I, in my experience in Canada, rode all sorts of horses, including horses who were highly trained, but some who were straight off the racetrack, some who were straight out of the paddock. And that ability to try to quickly understand my partner in the sport and be forgiving of his flaws, as I hope he would be forgiving of my flaws, I think is what led to the success that I enjoyed.
Fantastic. And tell us about the World Games. How did that go, Akaash?
Well, I have to say, the very first time, so the championships are usually held over 2 days. There are 4 sub-disciplines in tent pegging. And on the very first run of the very first day of my very first outing at the World Championships, I came last. And I mean dead last, as in the fetid stench of death hung about that performance. I did get better. But it is, if I draw a lesson from that, it is that one of the differences between success and failure isn't raw talent. It's the ability to bounce back from setbacks and the ability to maintain your morale. Because I won my medals at my second outing of the World Championships. But I also have to say that, notwithstanding the fact that that first day did not go especially well, I still felt an enormous amount of pride because I was riding for my country. And that's been another aspect of my experience as a national athlete in equestrianism, but as a national athlete more broadly. I sense that I have an opportunity to represent my country on the international stage. And in doing so, I'm conscious that athletes aren't simply participants in a game. We are also, to a certain extent, ambassadors for our countries, and that in a very real way, our conduct, our choices, our words, and our deeds project a sense of the value of our countries into the international arena.
Wow, absolutely, Akash. Yeah, we can't agree more. And a lot of learnings there for people who do go through, as horses is the biggest grounding discipline that there is, and relationship that there is, because one minute you're winning and the next minute you're literally eating dirt, on the ground, in a lot very
the
humbling.
question is, it's an object lesson in humility, and horses are, on the one hand, they are very forgiving of our flaws and our foibles. On the other hand, they are no respecters of individuals. So they take each of us as we are, which I think is a rarity in human relations.
Absolutely, absolutely. And tell us, Akaash, so with that, your work with UNICEF, can you speak a bit to that? And was this all in tandem, or did the horses come first and then your work, or was this all at the one time? Tell me.
They were all intertwined. I had always been involved with UNICEF, or rather, I'd been involved with UNICEF since my days at university. But I became more involved with the organization through equestrianism. The reason for that is that the first time I competed at an international level, at the world level, was in the Middle East. That year, the World Championships were being held in Oman. And tent pegging is a sport which has a modest following in North America and in Europe, but a very large following in Asia and the Middle East. As a result, the sport does tend to be dominated by Asian and Middle Eastern teams, some of which are very, very well financed, especially teams from the Gulf states. But equally, there is a rather tragic history of the use of, bluntly, the enslavement of children in mounted sports in the Middle East, particularly in camel racing. The reason children are used as camel jockeys in some Middle Eastern states is because they are small and they are light, and they put very little pressure on the animal's back. But it's also brutally exploitative, extremely dangerous, and many children are killed. Many of the children are pressed into it because they're poor, sold into it by parents who have no choice. And there are children who are killed in the sport as a result of being thrown from those animals. UNICEF was very much involved in trying to put an end to the exploitative child labor in market sports. And I thought that since I would be competing in the Middle East, and because I would be competing against teams that were under royal patronage in the Middle East, I had an opportunity and therefore an obligation to speak up on behalf of this campaign. And so for those games, those first international championships, and indeed for all of my subsequent outings on the World Championships, I rode in partnership with UNICEF. I donated my team's naming rights to UNICEF, and this act gave me the opportunity both to raise funds for UNICEF, but I think still more importantly, to make a contribution to the campaign to end the enslavement of children in mounted sports in the Middle East. And it has now, not because of myself, but because of the global campaign, it has now largely ended. It still happens in some states, but it happens illegally. And there are now both national and international laws banning the practice.
That is incredible, Akaash. And just from someone making a difference, from yourself, it is a global campaign, but because you stood out, it's very easy to kind of just stick to your own kind of inner circle if you were just doing your one kind of, the tent pegging. But the fact that you could see, when you're in the Middle East, wrongdoing happening, and you're able to make the change and start the ripple effect by, even if you are just one person, can make a huge change. And tell us then, Akaash, you also are involved with the horse welfare, I take for the ethics with the Olympics. Can you speak a bit to that also?
Well, after I competed at the World Championships, I then moved rather quickly on to becoming head of Canada's national team and National Equestrian Federation. Again, for someone who came to horses later in life, as you can see, horses have a way of drawing us in body and soul. They very quickly took over my entire life. So when I was riding as an athlete, I was doing that part-time. I was working in conflict resolution, but competing in my spare time. I then later on became the professional head of the national team as the Canadian Equestrian Team's chief executive officer. But that also involved work with the Canadian Olympic Committee, the Canadian Paralympic Committee, and work on animal welfare and sport integrity. I enjoyed that a great deal. And I would say that it was interesting. I mean, there are many lessons that I took away from that. One of them is that the way that we treat horses, the way that we treat animals, becomes a sort of metaphor for the way we treat one another. And that is to say, the way people treat horses is deeply revealing, because no one can hear a horse cry out for mercy. And as a result, people tend to let loose the best of them and the worst of themselves when they are alone with their horses. It brings out the extremes in personalities. But our ability to protect, and our willingness as societies to protect animal welfare, I do think is directly linked to our willingness as societies to protect the dignity of our fellow citizens. A society that allows cruelty and exploitation of animals is a society that is also, whether it acknowledges it or not, allowing cruelty and exploitation of other human beings.
I'm just going to need a moment. It's quite emotional. Absolutely agree, and all the viewers will absolutely agree with that. And you can see that throughout the equestrian industry globally, you know, from the sale of horses and how they're treated to all the different sports, but never link the two. Would never have thought to have linked the two of the treatment of animals is a direct link with how states or countries treat their citizens and their communities. So are you saying if we kind of look after one, you know, it'll reflect on the other, or is that your kind of ethos and mission behind it all, Akaash?
It is. I mean, even if it weren't, I still think it's important to protect animal welfare because they can feel pain. But I do think that for the vast majority of people in Canada have no direct experience of horses. And it's important I found that for me, it's important to make the case that even if you never come into contact with a horse, even if you don't care about horses, you should still care about horse welfare because it affects you as a human being, and it will affect your children. But having said that, I don't think that horses, as thinking, feeling creatures, are just means towards an end. I think, like any sentient being, they're an end in themselves, and irrespective of how much relative intelligence they may have compared to a person, or irrespective of what we may think about theoretical constructs like self-awareness and consciousness, the one thing that no one can deny is that horses have the capacity to suffer, and that means that we as human beings have a moral responsibility to protect them from unneeded suffering.
Absolutely, Akaash. Absolutely, and there is definitely something different. You know, all animals, you know, but there's something different about horses. Like people who have, you know, as I said, the connection with the horses, there is something, you know, a different intelligence there, as opposed to maybe just stock animals or cows, even though they certainly do feel pain also. But and that's at Flexineb, and with the work that we do even in epic management, horse welfare and horse care is at the root of everything that we do, you know, in our work every day, is to help horses. So we'll move on now with, I think, Akaash, with your kind of conflict resolution. So what have you done in regards to that? Tell us your overview.
Well, my time working in the equestrian and the high performance sports sector was a bit of a departure from my career. Prior to my time working as head of the federation, I was working on a small corner of what's now called the Oslo Accord. It was an attempt to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here's a spoiler: we didn't resolve it.
Oh, yeah.
But I do think that when there is a resolution to that conflict, it will be something along the lines of the Oslo Accord. But after my time as head of the team and federation, I went back into international affairs, first as head of the weirdly named Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, and then as head of the Mosaic Institute, which works explicitly on peace and conflict resolution. Many people, I think, would be surprised at that move. There doesn't seem to be anything particular in any obvious connection between what I do now and my work in horses. But I think there is. I think there are a couple of links. One is the international element. And the hardest, or one of the hardest aspects of trying to build confidence between people who are at enmity with one another is trying to convince them that they have something in common. And certainly anyone who's been involved with horses knows that if you ever meet another horse person anywhere else in the world, you may not come from the same ethnic group, you may not speak the same language, you may not profess the same faith, but the moment you realize that you are both horse people, you have a common bond and a common passion that brings you together. And that experience of understanding that there are things that are greater than the divisions that beset us as human beings, I think has carried through to my work. It's given me a great deal of optimism about the ability of different people to share common passions and to come together. The other aspect of it, and this has been what I really took away, I have taken away from my work in horses, is the power of body language. I know that sounds odd, but what I mean is, as you pointed out yourself, the relationship between a horse and his rider is a very intense one, despite the fact that there are no words between a horse and his rider. And for me, in my whole life, words have been important. The ability of words to express complex ideas, to rally people to high ideals, to bring people together. My whole life has been about words. And that part of my life with horses is a part of my life where words fail us. There can be no words between a horse and his rider. There is instead purely a language of the body. For any rider, every movement of your horse carries meaning, every look, every tremble, every shudder. And in my work in diplomacy since then, I found that I've become a far better judge of people based on their body language as a result of my experience with horses. Words can be used to deceive, especially in diplomacy, but our bodies always betray us. They always say what's going on in the backs of our minds. There are very few people, almost everyone in diplomacy has lied with their words, but there are very few people in diplomacy who have the capacity to lie with their bodies. And that language of the body is something I've taken away from horses. I guess the other aspect of it, though, is an understanding of the nature of the use and the abuse of power. Horsemanship is a partnership. It's a partnership between a person, a rider, and his horse. But it's a very unusual kind of partnership. It's one where one partner holds the rein and the other must do his bidding. It's therefore a partnership that is entirely reliant upon the decency, the humanity, and the empathy of the rider to put the best interests of his horse ahead of his own personal ambitions. And that sense that there are of the responsibility of power and the terrible consequences of the misuse of power, because the worst abuses in sport, I would say, happen in equestrianism precisely because a horse cannot cry out for help. That too has carried over and provided a lens through which I have observed power playing out in the international system, the terrible consequences of the misuse of power, and the responsibility of each of us, no matter how modest a role we may play in the international system. Each of us wields some power, even if we don't feel that we do. And that imparts to each of us a responsibility, a moral and ethical responsibility to use that power in a way that augments the dignity of the people around us rather than strips them of that dignity.
Absolutely. Very well said, Akaash. And do you see a future where we will get to a point where it's going to be more policed? Is it a case that we need to build a bigger community, or how do you see it happening in the future where that we really minimize that happening, the horse welfare and that abuse, kind of, instead of using the horses to a means in sport, because it is high pressure now and there's a lot of money involved, as you know, in all the different disciplines. And how do you actually, day to day police that?
I think policing is important. It's a necessary, but I think not a sufficient condition to bring about improved horse welfare, because there will always be people who find ways to cheat the system. I think it has to be more than just strong rules and strong enforcement of the rules, though that is important and that is vital. It has to be cultural change within the sector. And it has to be the willingness of people who are successful and high-profile riders, high-profile figures in the sector, to demonstrate that it's not a choice between being a good person and being a successful athlete, that treating your horse in a humane way leads to better results. And I really believe that to be the case. The athletes who are most apt to take ethical shortcuts are the least talented athletes. If you are a talented horseman, then you don't need to abuse your horse. You only need to abuse your horse if you're trying to supply your own deficiencies. And the idea that strong horse welfare is the best path to strong competitive performances is a case that I think leaders in the sector have to make over and over again. And when I say leaders, I mean all of us. We all have the power to, in our choices, in our words, in what we accept from those around us, we all have the ability to project leadership into our communities and into the world at large. And if I may say, I think Ireland is an interesting example of that, because I'm conscious that Ireland is a country of relatively modest population, yet it has an oversized influence in the equestrian world, in part because of the strength of its teams, in part because of its very long history in equestrianism. But each of us, when we are faced with an ethical choice, can find excuses to take the easy path rather than the right path. And one of the most ready excuses is, well, there isn't really anything I can do. Why should I stick my neck out when it won't make a difference? It will make a difference. And I think Ireland as a state is the exemplar of that. Ireland does play in sport, but also in international affairs. I mean, Ireland, as a Canadian, I will mention that quite recently, the United Nations Security Council held its elections for the elected seats on the Security Council, and Ireland beat out Canada for that elected seat. But I will say Ireland deserved that seat. The reason they deserved the seat was that, notwithstanding the fact that Ireland has a much smaller population than Canada, it has, in many ways, a much larger footprint in international affairs, especially in international development. The reason we all know about David and Goliath is because David beat Goliath. And that story resonates through all cultures and all societies because it expresses a universal truth. It's easy to say, I can't do anything, but the truth is we can do something. We may not be able to do as much as the next person, but we can do something. And the only question is whether we choose to do that or not.
Absolutely agree, Akaash. And do you see a global change from the pandemic and everything that's happened? And there has been, I can definitely sense that there has been a global change, and the whole world had to stop because of the pandemic. And I really sense that there people are starting to maybe get a bit more of a voice and feel a bit more empowered to take back control of their own lives when it was taken away from them, with the pandemic. So what would you say to them? What do they do to make a change? Is it just with their own community, with their own selves? Tell us, is there anything they can join? Do you have anything happening? Tell us.
Well, it's a big question. I do think I do think the pandemic has made a difference in all of our lives. The question is, will it be a lasting difference? I mean, it's possible that now that the pandemic, fingers crossed, is coming to an end, that people will feel such a sense of relief, they will just want to go back to their normal lives, to how things were before. I hope that's not what happens. I hope that we're able to summon the individual and the collective will to decide this is an opportunity to rebuild our societies and our relationships with one another along lines that reflect our values, our better values as people. Specifically in equestrianism, I suspect that there will be, on the one hand, a certain blow, a lasting blow to national equestrianism, but also a lasting opportunity. The blow is that I suspect that because over the past year, many, perhaps most competitions have been shut down, people who were involved in equestrianism primarily to compete have had to find other things to do. They have spent time with their horses, they've been training their animals, they've just been going for trail rides. Some percentage of those people will not go back to competition. They will have discovered that they have other things, other ways of enjoying their time with their horses other than going to competitions. And I think that's entirely fair. I think that means that once the equine sector starts ramping up again, there's an opportunity to say that there are many paths, many equally legitimate paths to enjoying your time with your horse. And I will say, even as a competitor, I enjoyed my time as a competitor. I'm enormously proud of the successes I was able to enjoy. But I started off as a pleasure rider, and I will end as a pleasure rider. Every rider is a pleasure rider, even a competitive rider. You don't have to be a competitor to take pleasure in horses. And indeed, if you're only riding to compete, there's a risk of losing the pleasure that brought you into it. So from that perspective, I would say I would hope that the national equestrian systems in countries across the world adapt better to reflect the fact that enjoying horses as an end in themselves is as legitimate as enjoying horses as instruments in competition. And I hope that there are opportunities that as the sectors try to grapple with this new reality, that there are increased opportunities to bring in non-traditional audiences into riding. As I mentioned, I came to riding as an adult. That's unusual. And I discovered a great joy in my life as a result. I would love to be able, I wish everyone I knew and everyone I didn't know had a chance to feel the same joy that I felt, that I feel in interacting with my horses. And I think that for National Equestrian System, there's a responsibility to share that joy with their national populations. But also, I think they need to recognize that if they don't do that, the sector is in peril. No one needs horses in the developed world. Horses are a choice. And as a result, for the sector to survive, it has to be because we invite more and more people to take joy in it, more and more people to participate in it. Because if there isn't an active attempt to recruit more people into the sector, then the sector will fade away. And that will be bad, not just for us as people, it will be bad for horses. Mm-hmm. There are no wild horses. Well, there are free roaming bands of horses in some parts of the world, including in Canada. But the vast majority, the reason horses have survived is because they've been domesticated. If they weren't domesticated, they would have disappeared. There are no true wild horses left in the world. And so we have a responsibility not only to ourselves as riders, we have a responsibility to horses to ensure that equestrianism continues in the future.
Absolutely agree, Akaash. Very well said. And tell me, are you riding at the moment, or tell us a bit about the team of horses you have and your team and your vets? Tell us about that.
Well, during the pandemic, I, like so many other people during the pandemic, I've retreated to my home, but I'm more fortunate than most in that my home is on a farm with my horses. My wife and I have, they really do accumulate. We have 8 horses, a pony, and a donkey.
Oh, wow.
Some of those horses are horses with whom I have competed, but most of them are retired and rescue animals. And I have to say, I enjoy riding the horses that I ride. I enjoy the companionship of the horses whom don't ride, and some of them are later in their years, I'll put it that way. But I recognize that I am more fortunate than most of the people I know, because the companionship of the horses has meant that the pandemic has not been as isolating for me as it has been for them.
Yes, and I've noticed that for a lot of people I've spoke to, you only realize during the pandemic how lucky the equestrian world are, and that we are to have horses as an outlet. Like work, people have learned, isn't everything. It doesn't. When work stops, what does anyone have? They realize they've just been working to live instead of live to work, or live to work. But the horses really have been a refuge for so many people, have helped so many people. And as you know, I don't know if you know, in Ireland, but they're a big therapy. We have a lot of therapy sessions for rehabilitation for children and for adults. It's all the different studies that that have happened with horses, the connection, like therapy wise. So I'm hoping down the line that it will become a need. Horses will become a need as opposed to a want. But yeah, and tell us a bit. You have a Flexineb too.
I do.
But how are the horses dealing with that now? Since we last spoke, you didn't have one, because it's quite, I assume, quite dusty in tent pegging, or what kind of ground do you work on?
It can be, although tent pegging is an outdoor sport. In Canada, I would say the greater challenge is for horses who are stable, especially during the winter, and spend long periods inside, because the air can be dusty, but it can also be very dry as a result of the fact that they are contained. I've tried I have to say, I was curious to see how the horses would react to it. They took to it quite well, and just the use of saline, I think, it will be, I think, an effective way to deliver moisture to them during the winter. They were a little skeptical at first, but took to it very quickly. I was pleased with the results. There are a couple of horses who do have respiratory problems, and they seem to respond to it very well. I've now loaned the system to my vet, and I'm not sure that I'm ever going to see it back because she has enjoyed using it. But next time she comes to do the next round of inoculations, I will tell her that she has to give it back to me. It's been very popular. I think that one of the reasons why it's been an effective tool is because it can be used as a delivery mechanism, either for just simple saline, or indeed for a whole variety of supplements or treatments. And the horses do take to it quite well. I must say, my horses are on 24-hour turnout, so they can be quite skeptical of things. They weren't skeptical of this.
That they've gone back to nature if they're on turned out all the time. They've gone wild.
Yes. Well, not exactly wild, because they recognize the dinner bell when grain is served once every evening.
Best of both worlds. But,
yes.
But I've definitely found with the Flexineb, with the high competing athletes that use it for their horses, they don't wait until the horse has something wrong with it, like asthma or something wrong. They actually build it into their routine to prevention instead of cure. You know, they actually have it in the routine, which I think is fascinating. So it's amazing the array of systems you can use for horses, just like people, to keep them fit and well and in care. You know, they don't even have to be competing, whether they're just kind of getting older also.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Horses by their nature are very stoic creatures, in part because in a state of nature, the horse who appears to be weak or injured is the horse who's going to end up as someone's dinner. As a result, they are predisposed to conceal illness until it's quite advanced. And for that reason, using preventative therapies, I think before there are obvious symptoms, is really important. I'd say another aspect to it is that I've found it interesting for recovery. So one of the in the competitive world, one of the distinctions between a horse who will make it as a competitive horse and one who will not is often the question of how quickly do they recover from high exertion. And clearly the ability, I would say that the Flexineb has been plays dividends in the ability of a horse who has just gone through high exertion to recover quite quickly. It helps to bring his breathing rate down to a normal rate faster than without it, and to bring his heart rate down. I suspect it would be especially well placed not only for horses who are involved in sports of explosive power like tent pegging, but also horses who are involved in things like eventing, because there is a requirement of a quick recovery after each phase in order to go to the next phase, and in endurance, where the ability to recover from exertion to go to the next phase is critical to the animal's success.
Absolutely. And we hope to see that everyone, by this time next year, everyone has a Flexineb in their barn, if not one individually for every horse. And even after speaking to you, that's exactly what I'm going to do now, is go out and put the Flexineb on my horse just to make sure he's okay, now that I know he conceals his injuries, because that's very interesting. I didn't even know that's their kind of they're in their minds, or what would you call it, their ancestry. Is it that it's kind of that their go-to is that they try to conceal their injuries and even more so, that's why we need to take care of them even more,
Absolutely. It's if, again, in a state of nature, a predator will watch a herd and will go after the animal who appears to be the weakest, because that's the readiest prey. And so it's in the interest of every animal not to appear weak, even if he's suffering.
Incredible. Unbelievable, Akaash. And tell me, where can everyone, if they want to follow you are you on Facebook? Do you do blog posts? Tell us how can they follow you online, or where are you going to next? Will you be in Tokyo?
I will not be going to Tokyo. I do some work with the Canadian, as a volunteer for the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. So I'm involved in trying to ensure that Canada's team and teams of athletes more generally who are going to Tokyo are doing so under conditions that protect their health and protect the health of the population at large. There are risks to Tokyo. There's no denying that. There's a risk to the athletes. There's a risk to, if the situation is not well managed, that it could become a super spreader event as people converge into one location and then disperse to the rest of the world. I think that the protocols that have been put in place are sound. So if they are followed strictly, then there should not be an unacceptable risk to Tokyo. But that's a big if. It's now all down to how well those protocols are implemented, and so fingers crossed. But my involvement in that will be from Canada. In terms of I do have a website. It's maharaj.org, maharaj.org, and I occasionally am on social media, and my social media accounts are all at that website. But I can't promise you that if you go to my website or to my social media accounts, you'll find anything particularly brilliant, but you might find something occasionally amusing.
I think people might want to see the 8 horses on the donkey.
The donkey is very popular. The donkey, I will say flatly, the donkey is the smartest member of the herd. She is wily. She's impossible to keep in any one paddock because she finds a way out. She goes where she wants and does what she wants. And I'm just lucky that she wants to stay on the farm.
Oh, fantastic. And what's her name, so we know?
This is a humiliation. Because there's only one donkey, her name is Donkey.
Pony called Pony also.
Pony is also called Pony because there's only one pony.
I'm sure there are many barns and stables in the similar situation. And that's how we're all linked. And there's Nick. Nick, apology I didn't introduce. We have Nick Long with us also, who is head of marketing with Flexineb Nortev. And we're going to close. Nick, is there anything you'd like to say to the fantastic Akaash?
Yeah, I've thanks very much, Akaash, for being a part of this video recording. And I'm really excited to actually share your story out into our channels, because you mentioned there a few minutes ago that your channels are probably not, all that interesting, but I would have to say they're fascinating. When I came across your story, I thought you were an exceptional human being, and this video just proved that some of the stuff you said there today was from the heart and passionate and just amazing, frankly. And it's a pleasure to have you a part of Nortev's, highlight reel about people in equine and the equine industry, and the conflict resolution and the humanitarian and the animal rights work that you've done is exceptional. And it'll be a pleasure for us to actually just showcase all the hard work that you've done on our channels, and hopefully we can just, show everybody what an amazing person you are and the amazing work that you've done so far. And thank you very much, Emma, for hosting this video chat. And it was fascinating being a member just in the audience today. But it was great, and thanks very much for producing this show today.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. That's what happens when you're an observer of horsey people speaking together. It gets a bit out of control. But no, so many takeaways from today, Akaash. Thank you so much. And we're really going to do a nice edit here for the viewers and really kind of highlight those takeaways. But I want to say thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And is there anything you'd like to say to all the fans, Akaash? You can go ahead.
Just thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation very much. I was delighted to be invited to be part of it. I wish you well with your work, and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you.